Thank you, Julie. I appreciate that. Apologize, I'm a little under the weather here. Well, certainly very apropos way to start. I had actually kind of forgotten it was September 11th today, so that certainly is the other September 11th that it's important for us to remember. And it's certainly very relevant to our topic today. I'm not going to go on a long soliloquy about Chilean history, of course, but the attitude of the Allende regime towards the state is probably what doomed them in some ways. But I think that it's important to, at the outset of anything, really get the definitions right in terms of what we mean. And I think when we talk about the issue of this, right on time, when we talk about the issue of the state, we have to sort of distill it to its essence, because the state, I think, is often identified, and correctly so, with the government writ large. But when we're talking, the government does many things. It has a lot of different functions. But when we talk about the state, the essence of it, the core of it, is what people would call the repressive apparatus. The state, the cops, the courts, the military, all of that. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? Because if you think about government authority as a thing, why do you pay your taxes or obey the law and all these different sorts of things? There's a certain amount of authority that comes from the state, and it's because of their monopoly on violence and the ability to imprison people. You pay your taxes because you don't want them to take money or send you to jail, and the same thing with more or less everything else. So what is the most constituent part of the state? Why do homeless people not go into hotels or empty houses and stay there? Because they don't let the police to come and to kick them out and potentially brutalize them. We could go on and on and on and on. I mean, this is sort of the nature of the cops, of the courts, of what it is, and that is the essence of why you, willingly or not, support many of the different things of the government. And I think it's just important at the outset when we're talking about the state that we get that together. And it operates on an international scale too, as Thomas Friedman once said, McDonald's doesn't work without McDonnell Douglas. And I think that's a very interesting quote, and it's certainly very relevant to the role the military is playing all around the world today. And the real issue when it comes to the state, I think, beyond anything else, is what stands behind the state? Because that's another issue, right? Like, once you've identified that the state exists, that oftentimes it is your frontline enemy. You are mad, for instance, at the police because of police brutality, or the mayor for getting rid of public housing, or Congress for cutting funds for basically anything good, at least in this day and age. These are the people you see. The front line is the state itself. It's the representatives. It's the institutions. But what stands behind the state? Is it really just the government itself? Is the government per se our enemy? Well, in a sense, yes, and we'll get to that. But also, in a sense, not at all. Because the state is not just a neutral instrument that exists in a vacuum. You know, if you are talking about the policies and practices of the things that the government is doing, these are things that are implemented by individuals, either elected or appointed by said elected person. And to become elected to office, what is the one thing you definitely need lots of? Money. You have to have lots and lots of money. Millions and millions of dollars. Both mainstream presidential candidates this year, I believe, have already announced that they're going to raise over $1 billion and are well on their way to it. So, I mean, that's pretty shocking that $2 billion will be spent for two candidates. And it goes up every year. And if you think about it, roughly the same amount of people vote in every election over, 5-10 year periods. And so the fact that every single election, that the amount of money that you need grows in a larger and larger degree. I think there's a lot of things that it says, but I think the number one thing it says is that they have a harder time convincing people that supporting these political candidates is relevant or something that you should be doing, and thus you have to continue to put more and more money behind these massive machines that really get out the vote machines in so many different ways that are all aimed at not only convincing you to vote, but to convince you to vote for a certain candidate so that they can solve your certain problems. But that being said, that money does not by and large come from the masses of people. Now, of course, many people give to election campaigns in small amounts of money. That's certainly a factor. But the way I always point out the difference is, and there's a good article in I want to say it was 2008. It might have been 2012. I'm almost positive it was 2008. About it was in the New York Times. Although I've seen the Washington Post do a similar article, and it was about what you get when you donate to a political campaign. And if you've ever donated like one of those little $250 or whatever, you get an email, maybe you get a letter, maybe you get some mass-produced picture of the president or something like that with a fake signature on it. I mean, that's basically what it is. And then the article goes on to detail how all of these rich people who were bundling, because that's the other element, right, of campaign finance. It's not really the individual contributions so much as it is, you know, me as an individual getting 30 of my friends who are also rich to give a lot of money, and so thus I get treated better because I am a bundler. The things that they get. And the one that really blew me away is how they were able to talk not only to the president on the presidential candidate on a regular basis, but also have direct input into the policy teams that were shaping the policies of the candidates in the area of sort of greatest interest to them. There was a certain amount of face-to-face meetings they got. They got all this special treatment at the rope line. There was ability to fly on the jet with the candidate. I mean, essentially, you get complete and total access. And then when you look after the campaign, and this is actually something you can look up if you so choose, the visitors to the White House, that's public information that they have to release. You know, if you give $250 to Hillary Clinton and you write 1,000 letters and say, hey, can I come to the White House? There's not a really high chance you're ever going to get brought into the White House on anything other than a tour. But if you bundle $150,000 or more, I guarantee you will not only get invited to the White House, but you'll get invited to all of the balls when the presidents and leaders from other countries come. You may get appointed to be an ambassador. That is actually the biggest controversy inside of the State Department, is the people who work there as career State Department officials are always very angry because they say, well, we don't get what they call there the prestige posts, Japan, England, France, the big countries. The only people who get those are really, really rich donors who raise millions of dollars for candidates, and then that's traded as a favor. You get an ambassadorship. So it's essentially just given to you as it's a diplomatic post that allegedly you're supposed to be doing some sort of job that requires some sort of expertise. And there was some scandals a couple years back, I think with the person who was the ambassador, I think Romania or somewhere like that. They didn't even know where the country was. So inevitably, they're also not doing any of the work when they get there. And in fact, and if you see, I once read a justification for this whole process that was, well, they're so rich that they pay to have the embassies renovated. So it keeps our embassies nice in countries like England and France because they're able to buy all this artwork and all this furniture. So, hey, maybe that's a rationalization. But the fact of the matter is, you don't really get elected president because you were the most qualified person. And, I was speaking somewhere last night and I brought this up. And if you maybe see me on Twitter, I went on a crazy rant on this in the middle of the week because I was so incredulous when this whole, it all grew out of this whole issue with Donald Trump saying that he wouldn't know the difference of Hamas and Hezbollah, or he'd know it when it mattered, or whatever he's saying. And so the guy, Hugh Hewitt, right-wing radio host, who's going to be the main guy asking the questions at the CNN debate next week for the Republicans, he was saying to the media in some interviews, well, I feel like I was pretty fair. I didn't ask him any gotcha questions. I mean, who's the president of Nigeria? That's a gotcha question. And I just said to myself, that is unbelievable. I mean, there are, I think, 180 million people in Nigeria. It's the most populous country on the African continent. Huge amount of trade with the United States. Large diaspora population in the United States. Major role in Africa. The main export there is oil, which is obviously one of the most geostrategic interests. The quote-unquote Boko Haram situation that exists right now, which is the whole tip of the spear of the war on terror of America and France inside of Western Africa. So it's actually one of the most major issues that the United States deals with on a regular basis, and yet you could be considered a serious candidate for president by the mainstream media without having any idea who the president is. And then the same guy, he goes on to say how he was talking to Carly Fiorina, former Hewlett Packard chair, CEO, who's now running for president, and how she was saying to him that she often got Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Hassan Nasrallah confused, so the head of ISIS and the head of Hezbollah, which also struck me. I mean, okay, if I stop you on the street and I ask you that, I'm not going to expect you to know. But these are two of the most significant issues, organizations, entities, countries in the entire Middle East that dominate thousands of column inches every week all around the world, that are major, major issues that the U.S., again, is directly involved in, and you can be considered, and this is the thing, because everyone says that Carly Fiorina knows things about foreign policy, and that was her whole pitch, is like, I know all these world leaders, and no one knows as many world leaders as me, but apparently she can't remember who they are after she meets them. But the fact of the matter is, that's considered totally cool, to just not have any knowledge about anything. So, quite frankly, it shows that the whole, and we could go on and on about this, but the whole point I'm making here is that, what really qualifies you to be president is being able to present the interest of your donors to masses of people who are not them in a way that pleases the donor, but also convinces people that you are for everyone, not just these really rich people. And it works, a lot of people vote, but at the end of the day, and a lot of people vote, I think, even though they know that's the truth, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. I was saying again yesterday that if there's one positive thing, maybe the one positive thing that comes out of the Donald Trump candidacy, it's that he revealed that rich people give money to politicians just so they can get things back from them in the first Republican debate. So at least a little bit of the veil was lifted there directly in the area. So the point being is that's what stands behind the state. None of the policies of the state are neutral. None of them exist in a vacuum. They all are politically motivated by the really small group of people who are backing these campaigns. They're all mostly billionaires, sometimes 100 millionaires. The Sunlight Foundation has a really interesting study about the political 1% and the people who give the most money and the money they give. OpenSecrets.org talks a lot about this. Really, if you spend about an hour to 2 hours just kind of tooling around, looking at these different things, the lobbying, the donations, all of the different access points, it, really, and let's be honest, if we go out on the street right now and ask every person, is politics corrupt? Everyone is going to say, yes, it is. So, it's sort of a basic reality, but I think it's something that, because of the way it's covered, is often lost. And I think the anger is often directed in towards the wrong people. But be that as it may, that is the nature of the state. We're talking about things like mass incarceration, for instance. It was not just some random idea that, all of a sudden, starting in the 1970s, you were going to economically hollow out all of the black inner city communities, cut the social services, and then instead of doing anything for people, put a bunch of prisons up there and a lot more cops who are really well armed with laws that enable them to entrap people. That wasn't just some random accident or series of events. It was related to a whole changeover in the way the country and the world was governed in the 1970s, so rich people could get more profit because the economy was messed up. And so they changed the whole economy, created a globalized labor chain, started exploiting labor in every single part of the world, draining a lot of things out of the United States, and they switched around their whole domestic orientation towards how they dealt with the poor and oppressed people in order to conform with that. So it wasn't as if it just sort of came from thin air. And in the book I wrote, Shackled and Chained, there's a whole chapter that sort of breaks it down, but you can sort of see exactly how these things were happening, and they were being pushed very consciously, and it was starting before the war on drugs. So, there's a lot of people who may say, oh, well, crack was so bad. The first mandatory minimum laws were being pushed in the mid-1970s. The Rockefeller drug laws came in the early 1970s. So at the end of the day, before some of the issues that made it seem as if the war on drugs may have been justified, not that it was, but be that as it may, you still have these policies being pushed. So I won't go too deep into that, but I think it's extremely, extremely important to understanding the next point. Because, what we're talking about in the book, I don't know what I do with my copy of the book, Revolution Manifesto. So we're talking about the state, again, not in isolation, just so we can talk about the state. It's an interesting concept. It's important to understand how things really work if we want to really make change. But at the end of the day, I think that, what we're looking at is not talking about the state, but confronting the state because of what it represents. So when I'm saying that it's representing a certain set of interests for a narrow group of very rich people, that also means that it's trying to prevent those who are trying to transcend that interest from succeeding. And when you just think about it, even down to the terms of how the debate is maintained. Unemployment and the full employment in the United States, for instance, is defined as 4% unemployment, which seems crazy, but that's what the government says, right? So that means that when you're at full employment, that things are working well and it's all good, even though 4% of the people are unemployed. Or even when you look at just the discourse around the economy and all these different things, last month, the job numbers in August to all the things like, oh, look at America, the economy's coming back, they created X number of jobs, less than 200,000 was what they're expecting, but over X number of months, 7 months, we've added jobs every 7 months. It means everything's coming back. So I did a little research, and I found out that, I was looking at something called the employment to population ratio, which is essentially the percentage of people who can work, who are working. And I decided to look and see what the job numbers were saying about this. And functionally, what you see, and I was looking particularly in this case as black males over 20, which is one of the subsets they allow you to look at. And I was looking at the employment to population ratio, and when I extrapolated out the numbers, what I saw is that to go from whatever it is now, I think it's like 59.1% of black males over 20 are working, which is actually pretty low from the employment to population ratio point of view. But that being said, to get to 100% the economy, just for this one subset now, black workers, male workers over 20 would have to have created 800,000 jobs in 1 month. And it couldn't create 200,000. So then I had to know what the number was for just the broader economy. And it was 8 million jobs. And they couldn't even produce 200,000. They can't even produce 8 million in 1 year. Cut that number in half if you say, okay, well 100% of people are never going to employ. The economy can't even produce 4 million jobs in 1 year. And they would have to produce it in 1 month for everyone who is able to work to have a job. And that doesn't even really get to the issue of what the job will be, right? Is it meaningful work? How much does it pay? All these different things. But it just shows you that essentially that there is a complete unwillingness by those people who are in power, the elected officials that are put there by those folks who stand behind the state, to actually propose solutions that meet the need of the problems they all acknowledge. Everyone will say, we need more jobs in America, people need to make more money in America, but no one will ever say, well, that means we have to create 8 million jobs, or let's just cut it in half, 4 million jobs every single year, that month, in a month. How are we going to do that? And obviously, the way they are going to do that would not be under capitalism. I mean, I think we have to get beyond this idea that the folks who own capital are those that they want to see everyone employed. They benefit from people being unemployed. It makes it easier for them to pay lower wages, because when you know someone will come behind you and take your job, then you will be much more open to putting up with everything. That's why they want a huge flood of undocumented immigrants in the country. And that's why, I mean, the whole American capitalism is based on a flow of immigrants coming from the most vulnerable areas of the world and being desperately exploited, either if they came here voluntarily, they were brought here like slaves, because the point being is that if you're afraid that you're going to be deported or whatever it may be, you are not going to raise a fuss. You're not going to ask for a higher wage. You're not going to say that the safety rules should be enforced, and so on and so forth. So all of these different policies are succeeding. There's no doubt about it. In the same period where I'm talking about the inner city economy being hollowed out, the rate of profit for corporations is going up. You see that people are making more money than they've ever made. The extremes of wealth are more significant than they've ever been. And so for that grouping of small people who are taking in all this wealth, things are going very well. And to maybe prevent people from disrupting the system, they might like to see things get a little bit better, but not necessarily from the point of view of their own self-interest. And so from that perspective, the state is also playing the role of preventing anyone coming into the discourse in a way that is significant. Look at the Occupy movement. We're here in the Justice Center, the Partnership for Civil Justice, a law firm. They're based out here. And on their website, justiceonline.org, you can look at the documents from the Department of Homeland Security that created these things called fusion centers so that they could coordinate with every single police agency all the information about all the Occupy encampments and all the Occupy activities in every single part of the country and coordinate their actions against them. And not only are they communicating between the government, you see they're communicating with private business. They're going to businesses and they're saying, oh, okay, well, we know from our information, Occupy Indianapolis, I don't know, some mid-western city is the one I'm thinking about, I don't know if it was Indianapolis. Occupy Indianapolis is coming, they're going to set up here, and just so you know, they're going to come and they're going to protest you and they don't like you. So not only are they taking in all of this information, they're sharing it with private businesses in order for those businesses to be able to sort of protect themselves, and then they're using that information all collectively to coordinate the crackdown on the Occupy encampments. So a movement that never even threw a rock at a person, never picked up a gun, never fired a shot. All it said was that the situation in this country, income inequality, is completely and totally out of control, and we are going to occupy small amounts of space in public areas in order to dramatize this issue and lead various actions and events aimed at reducing the amount of poverty and the income inequality that exists in the country. And the government still coordinated in an unprecedented fashion with every single police agency combined with private business to find a way to crack down on the Occupy movement. And so that shows you right there that even benign, seemingly benign political movements that are just raising issues or expanding the discourse still become the ire of gain the ire of the government and the state, because the people who stand behind them don't want to see the discourse around income inequality change. They don't want to see millions of people come into the street and say that they're opposed to, you know, big corporations and big banks taking all this money and these big bonuses and all this kind of stuff. It's the same thing with the Black Lives Matter movement when it was revealed that there was surveillance on Black Lives Matter. I mean, what threat has Black Lives Matter ever posed to anyone's health or anything like that? The only threat Black Lives Matter has ever posed to anyone are the people who are for the police wantonly killing black people and facing no accountability. But nevertheless, they're still investigating. And this is the government that, all these officials, right? I mean, didn't Barack Obama say, oh, well, it's, you know, legitimate for people to protest. They should feel fine to protest. Justice Department said it, all these mayors say it, Jay Nixon, governor of Missouri, said it, and they're still spying on you. So even when they're saying that what you're doing is legitimate, in reality they think it's illegitimate and a threat to them because it can build a movement that can threaten their power, which means it threatens the power of the people who pay their bills, and then you're a problem. You're a problem. And that's certainly why, you know, when we started out with the DC Ferguson, we said we want to do our marches in major commercial areas, because you start to become a problem when you hit people in the pockets. So from the point of view of where we are now, moving forward as a movement, I mean, I don't want to spend a whole long time running down a litany of problems. I mean, I think we all know more or less where we are in terms of this world. I mean, first and foremost, we're in an unbelievable sustainability crisis in the planet Earth. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the existence of humanity as we know it on the planet is certainly at risk because of you know, the way that we are treated. We know that, I mean, the whole reason I gave that jobs example, that essentially the ability of people to make any sort of decent living working is being essentially completely eviscerated. I mean, the other thing that's interesting about that employment to population ratio, and if you really want to look at this, if you go to the St. Louis Federal Reserve website, they have this graph where you can pick a bunch of data sets and look at it. The one thing that you notice, which I find to be very interesting, is the steady decline in the employment to population ratio. The peak is 1979, which is also the peak of industrial employment in America, and then it just goes down in a steady flow for white people. For black people, it goes up and down, but it still goes down. More volatile, same trend. Structural unemployment, the rise of computerization, the fact that fewer people are needed than ever, jobs moving overseas. What did Steve Jobs tell the president in 2011 when he said, how can Apple bring its manufacturing back? Those jobs aren't coming back. And so at the end of the day, you're seeing that there is, on the one hand, a race to the bottom in terms of wages, pensions, protections on the job in terms of safety, all of that kind of stuff. And on the other hand, you find that just in general, a larger and larger group of people are becoming superfluous to the production process. So that's another sort of crisis of sustainability, right? We live in a capitalist society. You've got to work to get money. You've got to have money to buy the things you need. So fewer and fewer people being thrown out of the production process, obviously a major crisis, not for them, certainly for us. Wars. I mean, I would say that the war danger is so high in so many different places in the world. We're obviously skating on a knife's edge. I mean, you see what's happening over there at the Asia pivot. Obviously the issues in the Middle East, where now what sort of quietly people have not really been noting is there's now more of a push to step things up inside of Syria, maybe even bring Western troops into Syria. Saudi Arabia, backed by the United States, is now drastically escalated with many troops into Yemen, which is also a very interesting issue. So you have all around the world a lot of different knife-edge points here where the war danger is very high. And I think that, the economy is a global economy. It's not a localized national economy. And we can't forget that even though the American economy, I would say, in some ways is getting a little better, even though it's not enough, if you sort of abstract it out from the world, you miss the fact that the world economy is still very sluggish, which obviously overlays any sort of sense of countries maneuvering for space and for resources and things like that, which always raises the chance of war. So we know generally where we are. I think that probably the people in this room, and just many average people, I think we can see this to a little bit in the bourgeois elections, are seeing that the path, it seems like the country is sort of careening towards disaster. And that no matter how much they say on TV and in the news about how things are better, how that seems to not actually be reflected in what is taking place. So the whole reason I raised the issue of the state and the issue of who backs the state then in relationship to that is do we even need to get rid of the state? Because you could say, right, well, at the end of the day, all of these things are bad, but aren't there sort of theoretically ways to deal with that within the context of the state? Bernie Sanders would say we can solve the jobs problem. We just need to repair all the bridges and the roads in America. And we do need to repair all the bridges and the roads in America, no doubt about that. Most of them are getting failing grades, which is an unbelievable death trap for anyone driving anywhere in America. Look at the Metro. Look at all the people who have been hurt in these accidents, killed in these accidents. Obviously, we need to do that. It's not going to create enough jobs based on the statistics I already gave you. We could go through all sorts of reforms that people could say are potentially good things, potentially necessary, potentially could be done. But I think it's important to understand that, the role the state plays, not in terms of just sort of enforcing certain policies or promoting certain policies, but what I said earlier in terms of restricting the discourse is really also related to what the state can do. And I think we have to recognize the foundation of the U.S. state is not in what they say it is, which is 1776, freedom, democracy, all of that. In fact, it's the exact opposite. In civics classes, they teach you that Federalist Paper number 10 about factions is the most enduring founding document that explains why the U.S. has this Republican system. And James Madison, who wrote it, goes through this whole list of factions that can arise amongst the population. And then he goes on to say that the most durable source of factions is the difference between rich and poor. And that in fact, nothing can ever be done to solve that contradiction. There'll always be rich people and there'll always be poor people. And thus a Republican style of government is the government we need to control the fact that if there's pure democracy, poor people will rise up and overthrow rich people. So in the very foundations of the Founding Fathers, their defense of slavery, the whole genesis of the United States military, which is in the genocide of Native Americans. So it's a property issue. Native Americans held land in common. European settlers and the people who were looking to own this land wanted to hold it in private so they could make money, and thus they had to exterminate those who lived there because they had a completely different sense, or really not much of a sense, of private property in that way. So the whole focus of the government is around this sort of sacrosanct principle of private property, and it makes sense because when you think about the way the government works, they only have a limited amount of control over what private businesses do. I mean, there's certain things, and businesses know this. This is why all businesses extort governments when it comes to, tax breaks, whatever. The number one thing that they say is, well, if you don't do what I say, then I'm just going to leave. Or I'm going to close down my business. And then what are you going to do? And, sometimes it's a lie. Sometimes it may be a lie in the sense that it's going to tank their business, but it's the truth that they will leave and that they will shut down out of spite. Businesses do. Walmart is actually famous for this, for just shutting down stores when people have any success organizing unions, or when cities say they're going to raise the minimum wage, just saying, oh, we're just going to leave. So they're able to use the fact that capital, what they have, is not really a thing, right? It's a social relation. Money is not capital per se. Money is a representation of capital, but capital is power. And, a good example, I think, is, we can take what's happening right now with public housing in Washington, where they have something called the New Communities Program, initiative, excuse me. And, gotta get the definitions right. And new communities, which now is kind of on hold. The point of that, and this is the whole country, starting with something called Hope 6 in the mid-1990s, in terms of the way the government gave out money for public housing. And so what they do is they go into public housing, they tear it down, they build up luxury condos, and they keep maybe 30 to 40% of the people who used to live in public housing, and they kick everyone out. And the reason is pretty obvious, right? Is that after World War II, and then again after the rise of the civil rights movement, you had quote-unquote white flight. People went out to the suburbs to essentially avoid black people, and at the end of the day, that was one process. But if you go to Europe, all the ghettos are on the outside of the cities, and the rich people live on the inside. And now, in this day and age, a lot of really rich people decided, why would I want to live so far away from my job, and all this cultural stuff, and all the great things that do exist in urban centers, and thus they want to move back. And so to facilitate that happening, the government comes up with all these different ways to gentrify cities. And I think it's important to recognize that the people in public housing did not ask for the New Community Initiative. They didn't want that. Developers developed the New Communities Initiative on their own, essentially on their own, some fake community meetings. And because of their ability to have money, think about what it lets to this capital, this power. This is what I mean when it's a social relation. It gives them the ability to determine who the representatives are, who determine the laws in which they operate. It gives them the ability to determine who works on every single project, whether it's a union project, whether it's not, whether it's DC residents, whether it's immigrants, how much they get paid. And it gives them the ability to set the terms of even how much affordable housing, because they control the politicians, is even happening. And just beyond the politicians, the revolving door, right? You work for the government, you don't make a lot of money, you work for, whatever, the housing authority, and you think, man, it would be great if one day I could make $350,000. The government is not going to pay you that. The developers will. So what are you going to do that's going to piss them off? Jack Abramoff, his book about how he would corrupt the congressional aides, it's the best book about corruption, because he'd always say, I would never just go bribe people or try to convince them right then for some reason. He was like, I would take them out to play golf, and I would tell them how smart they were, and how much I liked their work, and how they were doing such a good job, and hey, maybe we're not on the same side on this one, but let me tell you, if you ever want to lead Congress 4 or 5 years, you give me a call. And so now in the back of that person's head, they're always thinking, well, I don't want to piss off Jack Abramoff because he's about to pay me $1 million when I get out of here. And so it's all of these pernicious ways that just having this thing, this capital that money represents, gives you power over people. It gives you the ability to determine public housing residents don't get to live with a nice view. I want to live with a nice view. So I'm going to find the politicians and I'm going to make them kick those public housing residents out. And then when they say, what we really need because we don't want to be poor, we need jobs, I'm going to make sure that I put so many loopholes in the first source law in DC that you won't ever get a job. And I'm going to bring in somebody from Guatemala, I'm going to exploit the hell out of them, and then I'm going to pay some other politician to kick them out of the country, and I'll find someone else. It's all power over people. It's not things, it's power. And I think it's important to recognize that the government doesn't control that power controls the government. And so when we're talking about what really needs to happen and the need to meet the needs of people based on the actual need, not on the sort of perception that, okay, people need housing, so we'll meet like 1/65th of the need, but actually solving people's problems, not putting a Band-Aid on them, then we're really starting to talk about something that just, of necessity, because of the nature of capital that I just expressed, you want to make as much money as you possibly can, and money gives you the power to control the process in which that happens. That you have to move beyond the idea of reform, and you have to move beyond to the idea of revolution, and that's the genesis of the book, The State and Revolution, because really, in some senses, and I wrote down a quote. Amilcar Cabral, who was a liberation leader in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, said about revolutions, in terms of their definition, transformations carried out within the process of development of classes as a result of mutations in the level of productive forces or in the pattern of ownership are generally called revolutions. So what we're recognizing is that the pattern of ownership is what's holding us back. These people who stand behind the state, who like the way things are working, by and large, are the ones who control all the power that determines how humanity as a species reproduces their daily life, their needs and wants on a day in and day out basis. What's that Oxfam report? It's like the 800, 400, 200, however many hundred of people control 85% of the wealth in the entire world. There is the Swiss report that came out in 2011 with 147 interlocking corporations controlling almost all the shares of all the publicly held corporations in the world. This tiny group of people that has control of all the power that determines what every other person can and cannot do has to be changed. That pattern of ownership must be swept away. And I think that ultimately that's what the book is about. And I don't want to say too much about it because I want you to read the book. So if you want to know more about the general outlines, I think you should. But I think that is ultimately the aim of the book. Is we're saying that once you recognize, okay, one, the needs of people are far beyond what politicians are willing to do. Two, that means we need some sort of other system. And I think that that is becoming an idea with broader currency. I don't know, Mary Beth, you were with me at the Movement for Black Lives National convening. I thought 89% of the people there were talking about how we need a new system. So, I mean, it's in the air. So once you recognize that the current system can't meet your needs and that you need something else, then the next thing you really have to think about is what you are confronting. And that is the state.